So welcome everybody to the UK Reparations Conference, the second annual UK Reparations Conference taking place, chaired by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on African Reparations of the British Houses of Parliament in the United Kingdom. My name is Kobina, Amokwandoh, and I'm a member of the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations, Rep Africa, the Youth and Students Auxiliary, as well as various other formations for reparations campaigning and education. And we have a particular challenge today of convening a panel on the hot topic of reparations, international relations, and security. So before I start, I'd like to introduce those of our panelists who are joining us and call those on stage who haven't yet come up. We will be hearing, and we are joined by Professor Justin Hansford, who is the founder and executive director of the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center, reparations campaigner, and collaborator on the United Nations Declaration, United Nations Decade for Peoples of African Descent. He also has a background and experience in NGOs and working with the Obama Foundation on programs of reparative justice and redistribution. We will then hear from, we are also joined by Makmid Kamara, who is the director of the Africa Transitional Justice Legacy Fund, a grant-making organization based in West Africa that focuses on African transitional justice. And then we will hear from Sister Priya Lukka, who is the board advisor and facilitator on economic justice, reparations, and human rights to the United Nations. And then Dr. Sahidi, you can clap, yeah. And then Dr. Sahidi Bilan, who will be joining us on stage, please, from Niger, who is a senior lecturer and program manager, University of Sunderland in London. And then we will then hear finally from Sister Piaba Madokwe, who is a social justice advocate and former member of Parliament of South Africa. Piaba is also a secretariat member of the Pan-African Reparations International Standing Conference, parliamentary liaison, and educationist. And then last but certainly not least, Brother Omar Farfan, who is a communications and community educationalist from Mexico, working on grassroots education, and one of the key organizers of the Radio Zapote network, as well as a member of the Planet Repairs International Observatory Secretariat. So for those who are sitting down, please can you join us on stage? Thank you. Okay, we'd like to just start with a short framing because international relations and conflict is something that we are seeing plastered all over our social media, we're seeing it all over online, and as the world escalates towards a third world war, and potentially when historians get their acts together and accept that we are in that period, we know that our times are being increasingly marred by conflict, by warfare, by militarism, and by escalations of reactionary violence. And so we want to start to frame the debate and the discussion by what do we mean by reparatory justice in that. In 1884, colonial powers like those of Great Britain, France, Germany, and more met in Europe in Berlin, and at a particular time when interstate war was increasingly probable and mass decline was being experienced, collectivizing European imperialism, they began the carving up of Africa, the systematic division and planned invasions against Africa and her indigenous nations, and this was organized from Europe. Communities were drawn apart, lands were allocated and then violently seized through the launching of military operations against lands from Southern Africa, like Zulu lands, to the Anglo-Ashanti Wars in West Africa. Germany perfected concentration camps on indigenous communities in what became German Southwest Africa, while attacks were launched against Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. By the early 1900s, much of Africa was divided into colonial Bantustans for control and extraction. And 400 years prior, of course, economies were already being drawn into a globalizing economic order and Western hegemony that chatterized human beings and exported Africans around the world. In the many attempts at independence, countless wars have been exacted against Africa and her people, as well as the many documented and now evidenced examples of assassinations against African leaders who sought a path of reparatory justice and just peace. The question of today, then, is one, how do we frame the role of reparatory justice in ending the continuum of genocide, dispossession, and warfare that has proliferated on the continent, and make meaningful attempts to stop the harm of a growing new scramble for Africa that our historians are now calling the second scramble for Africa. We have seen on the news the terrible consequences of this never-ending war. We have known figures of millions of people displaced in Sudan, Congo, as well as across all regions of Africa. At the same time, the vast majority of our people are on the move demanding a new world order, multipolarity, and respect for the various rights to self-determination and reparatory justice, with a growing movement of the global majority now overwhelmingly committed to peace, collaboration, and new visions of the world. We're tasked at this moment to make sense of this question when we can see a clear commitment of states like Britain, like France, like the United States and partners across the Middle East and elsewhere fund and escalate militarization and genocidal warfare against colonized peoples everywhere. International relations and conflict are not just key responsibilities of states, they are the responsibilities of peoples of conscience and grassroots communities, as well as the reparations movement and its campaigns. And today's panel will hear from these key panelists, followed by questions from the floor and contributions. The panel is going to follow the following format. We will use the first 10 minutes we'll use the final 10 minutes for practical conclusions on practical working steps, making use of the all-party parliamentary group and its African reparations, and the challenge is for us to have a truthful, meaning dialogue on the types of action to move the movement forwards. So, without further ado, we would like to open up the question directly to panelists on the specific role of African reparations in negotiating and reimagining international relations, and how we can advance African reparations in the fields of conflicts imposed upon African heritage communities, with a view to understanding the role of reparations in navigating international relations, and what efforts are being made and what efforts should be made as far as reparatory policies to stop conflicts. We would like to have a first minute remarks from panelists on defining reparatory justice, as we've been tasked before, on how do we define reparations in this field, with due respect for pluriversality, decolonization, and African reparations. So this is just a short 1 minute for people to warm up your vocal cords. And if we could start with Professor Justin Hansford, who should be on our screen.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Perfect, yeah, we can hear you.
All right, excellent. Well, that was a wonderful framing. Thank you for inviting me. I wish I could be there in person. I say on a almost as a habit that reparations is what justice will look like in the 21st century. And to me, this speaks directly to your question, brother, because as we look to the New World Order, which is already here, if you were paying attention to the BRICS conference and things happening in Russia last week, we have already moved past a period of American imperialism completely unchecked. The New World Order is here. And reparations is being discussed in Ukraine and Palestine. It has become the lens of justice in the question of transnational relations. However, to ignore the crime against humanity that was enslavement and colonialism and its afterlife would be a new crime in of itself. So and I know we're under 1 minute, so I'm gonna keep this as brief as possible. It's my sincere hope that we can have this discussion today about creating global solidarity throughout our diaspora, understanding that reparations, it's not about just a check, as you well know. It's about repair. It's about justice. It's about the 5 elements of reparations that the UN has set out, which include, yes, compensation, but also guarantees of non-repetition of past policies, but also apologies, but also ways to ensure that our society is forever transformed not just a financial transaction, but a fundamental acknowledgement of the wrongs inflicted upon our communities and the fact that the gaps that exist between our well-being and the well-being of those who are inheritors of colonialism is because of a crime. It's not because of a gap in skills or a gap in moral desert. So I'll stop there. I know we're going to stop at a minute, but I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for that wonderful framing. And I can only hope that the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, which is going to have its next meeting on April 11th in New York in its 4th year, can be a asset in this conversation on a global scale as we go forward.
Thank you very much. And thank you for keeping that to a minute. Can we hear also from Makmid on the same question?
Yes, thank you very much, comrades, and greetings from Accra, Ghana, where I'm calling from. Like Prof said, I wish I was in the room, but I just want to quickly start by saying that I'm no longer the director of the Africa Transitional Justice Legacy Fund, which was my previous organization. I am now the director and founder of Reform Initiatives, which leads me to my definition of reparations or reparatory justice. For us, and for me personally, as someone who's from Sierra Leone, a country that was carved by the British Empire for to resettle formerly enslaved people from the UK, and a country that also produced Captain Thomas Peters, the maroon soldier who fought for the resettlement and return of the Maroons who were living in Nova Scotia. We see and define reparatory justice on those kind of 4 or 5 framings. The first one is around reclamation of human dignity, the reclaiming of the dignity of the African person, regardless of where they are in the world, is as a form for us reparation. Reconnection is a second framing. Reconnecting Africans and people of African descent, wherever they are, to the land and soil from whence they were uprooted. It is a form of reparation. Repair and healing. There's a lot of harm that has been done and inflicted on the Black body, historically and contemporarily, and those harms have to be repaired through healing, through psychosocial reimagining, and through what Bantu Steve Biko called the Black consciousness. The healing has to be spiritual, it has to be emotional, it has to be psychosocial and educational. That, for us, is a form of repair. And then reforming of systems and structures that were set up to keep us subjugated. That is a form of reparation and reparatory justice for us. And then the final bit is about resistance. When we come together as global Black Africans and collectively resist through a transnational form of solidarity, that is a form of repair and reparatory justice. I'll pause there and hand over to you again, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to continue on to kind of speed through this definition so that we can make sure that the rest of the conversation, we're using the same terms and understandings. So Dr. Sahidi, if you could quickly give us 1 minute on defining reparations.
Okay, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk about Niger. I'm from Niger Republic. Maybe most of you don't know. Because the country which is thank you, they are very often confused with Nigeria. They are 2 different countries. And Niger is portrayed as the poorest country on earth. But in reality, that's according to French literature, French media, but Niger is actually the richest country in West Africa and the biggest as one. So, but Niger has been subjugated for the last 63 years by France, who has been looting all the natural resources, oil, gold, uranium, and so many other resources. And Niger is also was occupied by French and a NATO military bases. And also Niger has suffered electoral imperialism. But since 26th of July last year, 23, so military coup has happened there, and the former president, who has been actually a puppet, has been removed. And since then, they asked all the NATO countries who have the bases installed in Niger to live. So that's how Niger came to integrate or to create with Burkina Faso and Mali what they call the Alliance of Sahel States, which was really a big strategy, to counter, the aggression plan to invade Niger and to reinstate the former president who was a puppet of France. And since then, all the streets in Niger have been renamed, so the colonial names have been removed. And the national anthem has been changed. And, and now, terrorism has been fought against, efficiently, because the three countries have synergized their efforts, and now they counter terrorists. And also, to finish, they came to know that actually the supply of weapons were from France and NATO countries. Thank you.
I'll jump in. Good afternoon to everyone in the room. Hello to everyone joining us online. So I think that reparations is maybe well defined by the principles that are there underpinning the work that is being progressed as reparations. And I think that is challenging Western-centric knowledge and approaches, recognizing that there are diverse knowledge systems, the shift of power dynamics to indigenous and local community leadership, and the empowerment for affected communities. But I also think that reparations is the political and social change being sought by movements in their expressions for repair. And it is also the uncomfortable truth that this poses to political leaders. So I think I would define it as both the process by which it's achieved and the work that we're doing to new visions and different outcomes.
And then next to Sister Piaba.
Is this on? Okay. Thank you very much. I don't think I want to add on too much because I think the previous speakers have sort of like covered what reparations is. But I think also what one needs to actually emphasize is that it is primarily about making amends of wrongdoings and taking positive action towards planet repairs. Because what we actually need to understand in terms of the harm that coloniality brought onto our shores, there was genocide, there was ethnocide, there was ecocide as well, and there was actual abduction and abandonment of African people. And those are things that we actually need to know, that when we're speaking about reparations and the fixing of the harm, what harm are we actually speaking about? And also, reparations should, of course, be premised on, number one, acknowledging of that wrongdoing, which to date has not happened. I'm yet to hear any country saying that we have done you wrong. It is also premised on a promise or a commitment to not repeat what has been done to our people. But what is happening instead is that colonialism is actually intensifying. Mm-hmm. It never left our shores, it just got refashioned, and it just keeps on intensifying. So for when we say that we are speaking about reparations of what coloniality did to us, as if it is not continuing or it did not continue, it's something that also should be important in the conversation on reparations. Thank you.
Thank you, sister. And then the final person, Brother Omar.
Thank you. Greetings. Well, in the context of Mexico, I would like to present the proposition that reparations in the ancestral nations of the Abya that they call Latin America, and also the descendants of the enslaved people that were brought to the territories of these ancestral nations. There's a direct way to tell this, that for reparations to be real, we need to have truth about the genocide, the colonial genocide of our people. And the second part of the reparations is that the colonial genocide of our nations, of our people, needs to stop. As Sister Piaba said, This colonial genocide is not about the past. It's something that is continuous, and the context of Mexico is a great testament of this. So, just to finish in that minute that Kobina gave us, this type of reparations, my position is that it is impossible that they come from the empire. The colonial powers that are the continuation of this genocide will never achieve a single step in the reparation of our people in Mexico. And the government of Mexico, and I could say this of most of the state nations of the Abya Yala, they won't make a single step towards reparation for our own people. So the only way that we can conceptualize reparations as a real thing is to view them in the struggle of the communities that organize in resistance against this colonial genocide, and to reveal the truth about the genocidal past is the only hope that we have to achieve reparations. Thank you.
So with that said, what we see is a growing consensus around what reparatory justice is, particularly in terms of sovereignty. And so we want to now open up back to the floor for everyone to make their 5-minute contributions on the following questions amongst ourselves, but to have this as more of a dialogue because we don't want to stick to one format. So really we're looking at the specific role of African reparations in negotiating and reimagining international relations and the world order, how we can advance African reparations in the field of conflict imposed upon African heritage communities, what efforts should be prioritized in reparatory justice stopping the harms as they appear in our communities, and in which African reparatory policies at any level of colonized, indigenous, and other communities in this world are relevant to this discussion or examples that we would like to highlight. So we're going to go back to Professor Justin Hansford, and then straight on to Makmid.
All right, thank you. So right now, speaking from my context here in the United States, descendants of those Africans who were enslaved here in the United States have now set up 29 reparations commissions. We have 3 state commissions: the state of California, the state of New York, state of Illinois. We have 26 city commissions. And most of those commissions do not focus only on enslavement. In fact, many of them, especially the local ones, focus more so on the legacies of enslavement and Jim Crow segregation, and their manifestations in the creation of what we would term the wealth gap in the United States between those Africans who have been stripped of their wealth over the course of generations, both through something called redlining, where their schemes to ensure that home ownership is focused in white communities as opposed to Black communities, and other policies that have really revolved around economic dispossession. And now this is a particular context in the United States, which is a hyper-capitalist context. That's the first thing to understand. So, our people are in a hyper-capitalist environment where, in order to even create a claim that will not be immediately shot down in the courts, it's often imperative to determine the tangible economic value of the harms. And so we have hung on to the economic harms that are most easily calculated, which end up revolving around, for us, this issue of the wealth gap. In fact, so many of our people in the reparations community have been thinking about reparations primarily through an economic lens, I believe, because of the hyper-capitalist environment in which we have to survive. But the process of the reparations commissions has pushed us to engage in larger thinking over the past, I would say, 4 years as these commissions grew up. I believe that personally, in this context, in 3 to 5 years, we will move from having 28 or 29 of these local commissions to over 100 of these local commissions. I'm opening something called the Reparations Bar Association, and we're going to be training lawyers, an army of lawyers around the country to specifically take on reparations lawsuits and reparations claims. As part of the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, also working on launching a international reparative legal committee to organize lawyers throughout the African diaspora who are working on reparations claims and provide each other support through the process of not just exchanging briefs and creating a roster of attorneys that would be available for people throughout the African diaspora to call on for cases, but also to create reports and analyses of our different reparations movements through a legal lens to see how we can learn and grow from each other. One of the dreams I've had with this permanent forum is to create a United Nations reparations tribunal for African people, so that we could have a way to create a platform to bring evidence before a body similar to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, so that there could be an accumulation of evidence. As an attorney, the one thing I think about the most is how every year we lose our people who could speak and testify to the harms that were done. We've created institutions around the country to capture some of our history, and I can't put enough emphasis on the creation of archives, Black archives in London. I had a chance to visit that during my visit a while back. And I know there's a Black archive movement around the diaspora, but it's still, even in spite of that movement, it's so small. And there's so much evidence, looking at it from a legal perspective, there's so much evidence that is being lost, and the importance of memory and the importance of collecting that evidence and learning from our elders so that we can continue to make these claims as we go forward is perhaps the most urgent of needs that I see right now across the diaspora. And so I hope that we can work together and find ways to gather all of our people to start these conversations and find a way to create a repository so that we can collect our knowledge and our memory so that it won't be lost, so that we can make these claims for justice in a way that, as I said earlier, I believe will set the standard for other communities who also were victims of colonialism in the past, in the present, and will be in the future, not only from the West, but we know also there has been colonial crimes and the need for reparations from peoples around the world who have harmed African peoples. And I don't want to forget that. So those are some of the things that are happening right now. And I am happy to be part of this conversation so we can continue to build that collective. Thank you.
We'll hear straight over on to Brother Makmid.
So a lot has been happening and going on from the continent. And I'm going to speak as someone who's based in Africa and doing work to complement the efforts that are being undertaken by brothers and sisters in global Black Africa outside of the continent. So during the opening session, we had the Abuja Proclamation of 1983. We heard of the Durban Declaration of 2001. We also heard briefly from Onekachi around the Accra Declaration of 2022 and the Accra Proclamation of November 2023 and the AU decision of February 2024 and a number of other documents and policies and frameworks that are coming up. Now, how some of us have been involved in those conversations. So in my previous job, we convene alongside other civil society organizations in the US and other parts of Africa. In collaboration with the government of Ghana, we co-hosted the Advancing Reparations and Healing Summit in Accra in August 2022. And then the following year, the AU issued a fundamental decision. It was not a declaration. I think that is one thing that perhaps we need to clarify here in terms of what is available and just differentiating between soft law and kind of other instruments that are being used to advance reparatory justice and healing. The AU made a decision. This is different from a proclamation. The decision is binding on AU member states. And that decision of February 2023 was to ensure that there was a summit that should be organized and a proclamation from that summit will form part of the AU's agenda going forward when it comes to reparations. Perhaps just to speak to the question, it would be really good to just understand and situate where things have been and what we have been doing as civil society alongside government and intergovernmental organizations. You know, I joined the Pan-African Union, PANAFU, which a lot of people don't know about anymore, at the age of 11 when I was in the Eastern Province in Sierra Leone, in Kenya. And I was privileged to receive some tutelage from senior comrades like the late Abdul Rahim Tajuddin, who's now transitioned. And the principal engagement during those times at a very young age when we were kind of being schooled around Pan-Africanism and reparatory justice was reparatory justice education. What was then, it has now been kind of co-opted into human rights education. Our original teachings were reparatory justice education. It was not even human rights education. It was later on that it was westernized to become human rights education. Another thing that I also want to kind of differentiate and make clear is the connection between reparations for conflict-related crimes and reparatory justice for historical crimes that have been clearly identified by previous speakers, which is the transnational enslavement and trafficking of Black people, colonialism, and neocolonialism. In fact, some people will extend it to even apartheid. And as you know, Kwame Nkrumah described neocolonialism as the most wicked form of the continuation of the subjugation and exploitation of Africans and African resources. So this distinction needs to be made very clear in our efforts to advance reparatory justice. Again, I keep repeating where I'm coming from, which is Sierra Leone, and Sierra Leone has experienced not just the enslavement of its people, but a conflict that was triggered for the resources of that land, which is the diamonds. We experienced 10 years of war. And again, a reparations mechanism was created, supported by the government of Canada and other countries. So perhaps the few things that I need to mention when it comes to this policy development and how we engage from the continent is that we see reparatory justice as a process that is about people in as much as it is about institutions. Repairing and healing people, reforming and reordering institutions, reordering the international order. It is not simply an area of inquiry that academics, policymakers should study or examine for the sake of curiosity. It is about lives and livelihood. It is about humanity and dignity. The dignity and humanity of African people, African lives, African livelihood. Reparatory justice should be seen as a set of practices to remedy a wrong. Importantly, it should also be seen as a form of politics. So those who are trying to avoid the politicization of reparatory justice, my challenge to you is that you cannot depoliticize reparatory justice, because it's the political actors and the geopolitical structures that have been set up that need to be dismantled, reformed, and reordered to ensure that we actually achieve reparatory justice in its truest sense of the form. So for many of us in and outside of the continent, we're engaging in this process because it is both a source of hope as it has been a source of disappointment for those who came before us. As the brothers mentioned and as sisters have mentioned, a lot of people have died. A lot of people have been silenced. A lot of people have been marginalized because of their demands and calls for reparatory justice. That should not deter us. In fact, it should serve as a source of aspiration as well as inspiration. It is a demand. This is why the declarations and the proclamations that you are seeing and hearing from Africa are making demands, not just to the profiteers of colonialism and the enslavement of our people, but for those African leaders who are operating within the continent and who seem to benefit from the status quo. It is a demand. It is not charity. One of the things that we keep saying is that the way the current international system is structured, it is already imbalanced. The power, the dynamics, the hierarchies, everything is skewed to promote whiteness and white supremacy. But there is no doubt and there's no question now that the post-1945 international order is what is in a crisis that has been described as polymorphic. And this is manifested in various shapes and forms in the way current international systems and structures are trying to project themselves and position themselves. It requires a comprehensive fix. Part of that fix will form part of our reparatory justice that we're demanding. That fixing should be moral, it should be legal, it should be political and socio-cultural. It is both a project and a process with the sole aim of conducting a deep cleaning, deep cleansing of not just the mindsets, but also of the operation and application of what is in the mind for the continuation of the subjugation and exploitation of the African people wherever they are. There's also been a compression of history and knowledge. And that's why I'm happy to hear Professor Justin Hansford mentioning the need and the importance of archiving.
1 minute.
Memorialization. I've got 1 minute?
Yes, please.
All right, I'll wrap up. So memorialization and an intergenerational conversation. Because as you can see, a lot of people have come and gone. A lot of people are still in the space, but there are new generation of activists and practitioners that need to get involved, that need to be conscientized and educated to ensure that this is a struggle that came before us, that this is a struggle that will continue and it will not end with this generation. Intergenerational conversation is what within the continent we are trying to build. It is what reform initiatives have been trying to ensure, that we connect policy and practice, connect the policymakers with the activists, connect the leaders at political corridors with the leaders at the community corridor. We are making sure that as a truly ingrained movement that has mass mobilization, because this should not be a conversation that is just limited to the rooms and these platforms, but it should go down to schools, it should go down to universities, we should use our systems and structures at community and technological influences and opportunities that we have to ensure that every child understands that reparatory justice is the 21st century human rights cause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're going to continue the same 5 minutes with those in the room. Dr. Sahidi.
Okay, thank you so much. I will go back to Niger and define what reparation may mean. It means acquisition of sovereignty, which has been denied for the last 63 years, and also restoration of African dignity and the dignity of local people, the right, to go back to take from the, history, from the culture, be it economic systems or political systems, because we are not just, Africa has not been built ex nihilo. The rich culture, which is even anterior to, European and the West civilization. All of you know about ancient Egypt, and how this culture has been shining for more than 25 centuries, and that culture which influenced the whole world. And so when you talk about culture, culture is firstly in Africa, because human beings come from Africa. So justice, epistemic justice is very important. So the right to use your local knowledge. But if you take, for example, many Francophone African countries, they have been alienated because of the assimilation, way of colonization has been chosen by France, so which consists of Africans to deny themselves, to forget themselves, and to even sing, for example, what they call La Marseillaise, the national anthem of France, where they believe that their ancestors were Gaulois, which is not real. So, yes. Now, what African countries have done in the western part of Africa, the Sahel countries, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, they understood the necessity to come together, to synergize the efforts, and also to form a bloc, because they understood that unity is power. So since then, they were able to drive out France and NATO out of all the Sahel countries. That's a fact. And secondly, now, in terms of currency, they need to go out of that currency, because that's a sign of alienation as well. Because can you imagine your national richness has to go to France if you want to buy, for example, anything from other countries, it has to go through France. And whatever is sold, France will get 50% of that. So whatever you want to buy or whatever you want to achieve, it has to go through France. So the behavior is that as if all these countries are minors, have not reached maturity. So this is taken now really, this awareness is now raising, and people understood that France is just a country. It's not the universality as they claim to be, they're not. So this is really a first step. And secondly, African countries, Sahel countries have tried now to diversify now the partnerships, by trying to join, for example, BRICS countries, and also trying to be in touch with Turkey, Iran, even North Korea. So to show that they're free to choose what is beneficial for them. So I think that's a big step. Yeah? So that's how those countries are trying, and we are very much convinced that with the time also other countries will join, because you cannot continue to enslave people and the young people, because in that region more than 90% of the population are young and have less than 25 years. So they understand what is going on, so the exploitation cannot be continued like before. And another fact is that communities, because all these colonial countries, try to divide and rule. So it's to oppose, ethnic groups against each other, to fight each other in order for them to come and loot resources. Like what is going on in Congo, Kinshasa right now. One of the biggest countries in Africa, the richest country in Africa, but now it has been balkanized, divided and into small entities, and they constantly fighting each other. In the meanwhile, imperial powers are looting. They continue to take all the resources. So we are very optimistic that, countries like, for example, Senegal, Guinea, and all the 15 countries which are part of ECOWAS will definitely, with time, join, IS countries. So Alliance for Sahel State, they will be joining those groups,
We're going to get a roaming mic to you in a second, yeah? Would you just go for a couple of minutes?
Sure. So I think it's a unique time for taking recognition of where debates on reparations have reached. And I think we're all here because we know that there's so much more to do in what feels like narrowing political environments. And despite history, the history of colonialism and slavery, there's still a massive failure to properly and adequately address how injustice arises today. So that understanding of colonial empire, Mangamizi, the ongoing racial and global caste empire hierarchy, in South Asia, the way upper caste elites control political power and deny rights to lower socioeconomic groups, and the ongoing domination of white economic power. So just as one example, why people of color in so many settings across the world face higher interest rates. I would argue that this should and needs to be more visibly linked to the outcomes for Black, Brown, Arab people, all marginalized groups, and the ways in which, therefore, rights and power are denied. So if we're exploring remedy and justice, it brings us to the issue of structural inequalities between countries and those faced by historically marginalized groups in countries across all parts of the world. So it's not just past structures of harm. I think in possibly all current economic governance today, there is corporate greed that is enabled through tax, trade, and loans that enforce austerity, and that means that workers have to accept exploitative working arrangements, wages, debt contracts, forms of consumption that privilege the owners of capital above themselves. So when the UK's empire ended, people were freed, but freed into a life of poverty and an unfair wealth redistribution. So pursuing equity that can move us forward on reparatory justice really has to look at what mechanisms are available. There is some possibility of using like a rights-based approach as set out in international human rights laws, where there is a stipulation for progressive realization of rights of groups, particularly those who have been marginalized, and that's an obligation for all states. So this can happen through the tracking of resources that are spent by states in how much is provided for economic and social welfare for marginalized groups, including for racial and ethnic groups. But rights are not just about government spending. It is also about representation, the reallocation of captured assets by colonial and neo-colonial systems or any other system of racial subordination. And I think this takes us into kind of looking for more permanent forms of remedy that seek a restoration of maybe assets. And it's really not beyond government policy to make these kinds of things a reality. So damage for harm caused as a tool of litigation has been used in all kinds of settings. And even when we look at like economic disparity and things like income, employment, wealth, and for how it affects subpopulation groups, it's usually the inequity, the lack of power that drives the inequality. And therefore, like I'd argue that, you know, in thinking about international relations and development ideas, it's not enough to just think about inclusive economic opportunities. You need to think about how assets have been drawn up in the way that they are in this post-colonial movement. And if abolition policies can mean that slave owners have been compensated for their immoral economic loss, that's all recorded in the UCL database of British slaveholders who received compensation after 1833, then we know that fiscal policy can be used in all kinds of ways. And I think that if we're to see reparations achieved more broadly, we need to follow the money and decision-making chain of how imperial power and capital supports ongoing imperial domination. Most of the time, that system runs smoothly. What kind of disruption, as we're seeing now in the midst of conflict and an implosion of kind of different factors that are kind of being understood about the differential enforcement of human rights, what disruption will force that serving of humanity rather than the interests of power? And I think essential in all of this is the elevation of local agency. So providing communities with the tools, funding, autonomy, encouraging ownership of progress, and also I'd really stress the reducing the reliance on external entities. So economic models of high export dependence and high concentration on a few commodities have been really recommended as the way forward for African countries for quite like 2 or 3 decades now as a condition of loans being provided. And Kobina talked about this as well in the opening, and that's become characteristic of the African economy. But in times of crisis, this leaves our countries highly exposed. So repair is also about moving away from that traditional model of development. And just to wrap up, just a few ways in which we can think about like what that might mean: acknowledging the historical injustices, reckoning with the British legacy, but other countries' legacies as well of colonial exploitation and the historical wealth extraction, and the relationship, therefore, to formerly colonized nations, and then thinking about what that means for what kind of reparative justice frameworks are needed to address past wrongs. Crucial in that is, of course, holding multilateral institutions for account. I can't stress that enough. And, you know, questioning why that structural change from systems that keep people subjugated is still the elusive part of what is being demanded that is still so hard to achieve. And I think within this, really recognizing that there are different cultural perceptions of justice and development. There are truth-telling traditions, indigenous traditions of relationality that encompass ideas for healing, restoration of dignity and sovereignty. And if there were to be a process of a commission of inquiry, all of these traditions and their approaches and their processes can be really recommended and can be really like understood for the value that they bring. So in summary, I think it really matters that today we have repair approaches in depth and just climate justice spaces, and that there are communities seeking remedy for human rights violations and crimes against people, against all groups who've been systematically discriminated against. It matters that we have leaders of countries like Ghana and Barbados arguing for an acknowledgement of harm caused. And I think there is a disruption for the justice being sought in all kinds of spaces. But I think we also can see as well that there are institutional requisites that are not yet there in the multilateral framework that would enable the kind of radical changes to global economic systems that would bring about changes. In summary, it's not just about resource flows. I've been doing work to map what different communities progressing towards reparations are doing in their work, in their activism, in their movement spaces. And there is so much to learn about the transformative changes on a global scale, and many revolutionary views are real critiques of neoliberalism. So I think we're at a time to really find ways of expressing this, find counter processes if they're not being made available to us, so that we can visibilize these extensive traditions to reparations pathways and make them a reality.
Thank you, Priya. Now we're going to go straight to Sister Piaba and then Brother Omar. Yes, you can ask a question.
I find the conversation of reparations a little bit difficult. The reason being because when we demand it from the leaders around the world who supposedly owe us money and resources, they say no, or they apologize and then withdraw the apology, as seen in Holland, or they don't apologize at all, as seen by King Charles in Australia. Now, with that in mind, don't we think that reparations needs a rebrand? Now, me personally, I've probably generated a few £1 million in social value over the last few years. That is by connecting community to business and then yielding results. And I think that is such a more practicable and affordable way, similar to what you were talking about, counterintuitive processes to achieving some of these things. What space does this conversation conference have for behaviors, actions, initiatives like that? Because sitting around talking about this when they've denied us for decades seems counterintuitive.
Thank you very much. So just before we pass that on, that is a really valuable correction, because the whole point of this framing of this conference was from dialogue to action. And we've already heard from the panel so far key practical actions that, in fact, whole countries and states have taken as far as reclaiming sovereignty, and the brother was listing some of those policies. So how those things all come together is definitely part of why this dialogue means that we should be able to escalate our tactics, but it's also why we need platforms so that people who are doing different types of work can be in dialogue with each other. So I'll pass that straight on, because this is also thinking about the question of conflict and how that marries with your tactics. You know, its relevance to conflict is something we also have to understand. So I'll pass that straight to Sister Piaba and then to Omar. But thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. I think 5 minutes is a bit too short, but one will try to actually cover this conversation on international relations. And I think that one of the things that we need to also just think about is that when we speak about international relations, it is important that we look or we question the position of those who were historically oppressed, if I may put it that way, before coloniality or during coloniality versus so-called post-coloniality. And we would see actually that there isn't much of a significant change. And that is why you find out that the battles that we are fighting as much younger activists, if I may put it that way, are battles that have been there forever and they have been fought before. So the fact that we're even fighting shows that there's something that is just wrong. We also have like a generational mix also in this conference, which therefore shows that there is a consensus somehow across generations and across people from different nations as well, that something has to be done. And the question on reparations as well is and security is us actually even questioning why what creates the chaos? Why do we need the security in the first place? And if we were speaking earlier, we were speaking during the introduction about the Berlin conference, which basically preceded what happened before. But what we are seeing right now, observing right now, is what one would call the new scramble for Africa's mineral resources, if we put it that way. I think that was elaborated on as well quite briefly. And And you then question yourselves that if we say that we are speaking about international relations, what are the relations between us and so-called former oppressors? We speak about the fact that they've never acknowledged. They have said, by the way, that they will never acknowledge the wrongdoing. So what is our response? And I think the theme of this conference is very important because it says that from acknowledgement to action, which therefore means that we're here to speak about what is the action that needs to be done. Because the reality is that our opponents are not speaking. Our opponents have been acting and acting violently for that matter, which therefore means our responses, whether violent or not, it would be actions that we are defending ourselves from decades, in fact, hundreds of years of actually being at the other end. Now, when you look at the positionality of Africans, it's not just Africans, like your Asians, your Latin Americans, those were historically dispossessed, if I may put it that way. It's not even a matter of that we were dealt the wrong hand when the conversations around coloniality is ending, post-coloniality and whatnot. We were dealt that wrong hand, and over and above that, another game set somewhere in our exclusion. And that game actually solidified our fate as people who would be perpetually oppressed and who would be perpetually dispossessed. And that is something that we are mostly only realizing or waking up to now. Hence, the conversations right now are about that coloniality has not changed. It's neo-colonialism, it has refurbished itself, and we are actually calling for reparations because even the call for reparations did not happen in the 50s, in the 70s, in the 90s, when the African countries were getting their so-called freedom. It is intensifying perhaps in the past 5-10 years because we have come to realize that there are conversations that were supposed to be had at that time and they did not have. Now, South Africa, for instance, I think we would know that it went to its elections this year, and we thought that we are going to actually change governance and everything. And as much as the ANC, which is the so-called ruling party, is still ruling South Africa, the reality is that it is ruling South Africa now through an arrangement, a very problematic and a serious sell-out arrangement, which is what we call the government of national unity, where they've actually gone into bed with capitalist, anti-black, anti-progress political parties so that they can cling onto power. So at this point in time, there's actually no political party in South Africa that has actually won elections. It is through that arrangement. And that on its own should show you that people are actually waking up and they are responding. When we're speaking about actions, it's actually rejecting even these governments that went and posed as liberation governments, whereas they were actually in bed with our colonizers. What also is happening, or what is happening, is that the ANC perhaps and these political parties, yes, they have gone into this GNU arrangement, and that is perhaps what is also being taken into the world right now, or the picture that is being painted. But even internally, you'd find out that members of these political parties themselves are uncomfortable. They are questioning these decisions, and it is important that we actually intensify the conversation around that. There is something that is totally wrong about how South Africans' governance currently is structured. And when we speak about the world order as well, and when one speaks about the new scramble for Africa, you have what is now the conversation around just transition, which on its own is going to need a lot of extraction of mineral resources. And those mineral resources are not going to come from anywhere but from the African continent, from the Asian continents, and also from Latin American continents. Now we ask ourselves, why is it that the European Union, if they are not colonizers and if they are actually having a good relationship with all countries, having or had created like the Critical Raw Minerals Act, which actually speaks about how, where, and why certain minerals will be extracted. And that conversation is happening outside the 3 continents that actually hold these raw materials. You ask yourselves, why is it that the election campaign of the United States is premised around we are going to strengthen our economy through oil and gas? And this is now happening also after the discovery of oil and gas deposits in the African continent, which were also followed, by the way, by chaos and instability, especially in these countries where these oil and gas deposits were found. Immediately after they said there's oil and gas found in Mozambique, all of a sudden there was instability, there was wars and all these things. Now, that is, when we speak about security as well, we must also be able to know that where there are mineral resources found and the West has interest in those mineral resources, there is bound to be instability. And that is why we're finding that they're actually even funding the rebel groups and all these things, and they're creating this instability. So how do we expect those very same people to actually sit down on the table with us and we find each other when we have not found each other for centuries? They sit down with us, they tell us one thing, but their actions are totally different. Mm-hmm. And it is for all of us to see that. So what is the response to that? I think that the formation of the Alliance of the Sahel States, for instance, I do not want to lie. I think for any person of African descent, anyone who's African, and anyone who actually identifies with Pan-Africanism or just general liberation of people of the African continent, it is one of the most important developments in the African history. Because for the first time, what had been conceptualized as Pan-Africanism is happening right before our eyes. But it is just 3 countries out of 54. Where is the rest of the 51 countries? You have the African Union, it is mum on the question of the AES. You have the Pan-African Parliament, it is mum on the question of the AES. The people of the AES are basically fighting the entire world order on their own, and there's no one that is speaking on their defense. There's no one that is actually even, at least at the very least, saying that we are in solidarity, we see you, keep moving. And all the decisions that they are making there, they're the decisions that the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, when they were speaking about the United States of Africa, said that needs to be done. So they did not get into power. They took it, by the way, the power. They didn't just get it. They fought for it. They took it. And they said, after this, we are going to prioritize our people. So why is it that when 3 African countries sit down and say that we're creating our own defense force, we're doing our own, we're taking our own minerals, we're prioritizing our own people, they are vilified, they're demonized, and they're attacked left, right, and center, to a point that you have Western powers putting army bases on African soil surrounding these very same countries. I'm sure there is no African base outside of Africa. There is no army base of Latin America outside Latin America. There is no army base of Asia outside of Asia, but you have army bases of former colonizers on our back doors. What are they doing there? And the moment we say we do not want you here, it's a serious issue. They intensify, they start funding rebel groups so that it is not them that are actually committing the violence, but someone is doing it on their behalf. And then we must come and say that everything is fine. So when we speak about the question of international relations and security, we must also know that it is very much tied to the resources of the African continent. And that whatever happened post the Berlin conference is happening now. It is actually intensifying now to a point that they've even stopped pretending that they are with us. I think also just to speak about the policies that are there, I think you spoke about existing policies. Policies are just things that are written on paper, unfortunately. I think as a person who served in parliament as well, I actually had to deal with that harsh reality that most political or parliament processes are just about writing reports and adopting them and keeping them there, but they are never implemented. So I think that it is important that whatever policy proposals that we make as people, especially they must start from the grassroots up. They must be, they must be conceptualized by ourselves. And Politicians, by the way, that's why I hate it when people say I'm a politician. I know even on Wikipedia it says politician. No, thank you. But anyway, they are employees of the people. They are in office to represent the will of the people, what is wanted by the people. But that is not what is happening. Instead, they go in there and they do their own thing. And that is where we need to know, how do we actually hold accountable those that we have put in office, outside just voting. I think the policies that we also need to perhaps look into in terms of restructuring, of course, using the concept of the United States of Africa as a backdrop. I think that is the best option to go around. But we would have to look at the question of security and defense and policies that actually are pro-African people. Would have to look at the question of land and mineral resources. Would have to look at the question of financial institutions. Would have to look at the question of decolonization and the diaspora. We'd also have to look at the question of food security and environmental justice. Because one thing we said is that coloniality did not just displace and harm Black people or Africans as humans, but it also harmed our environment, our homes, our land, our plants, our animals. And there needs to be justice at that level as well. Thank you very much.
So our final contribution will be from Brother Omar, before we will then take up to 3 questions and then have a space for roaming contributions while we finalize the conversation. So Brother Omar.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we only had 1 minute last time and I forgot to give salam. Moving along. With 5 minutes, I will try to explain what we mean with the proposition that for reparations we need truth about colonial genocide, and what we mean by the proposition that the colonial genocide is continuous. For this, we will have to go back to the 15th century. You know that at the end of the 15th century, the Spanish colonial invasion of what will be called by them the Americas began. At that time, it was also coincidental with the fall of Granada, and the genocide in the Iberian Peninsula also started. Here in Nabya Yala, in what they call the Americas, Tenochtitlan, what we now call Mexico City, was the most populous city in the world, as far as we know. And in the ongoing war of destruction of the civilizations in Mexico, it was the Maya people that resisted more or less 100 years. So during a whole century, the indigenous civilization of the Mayan people, then they lived along in war with this Spanish invasion. In this century, it was we had the expulsion of the Muslims of the Iberian Peninsula. It was 1574, no? And the expulsion of the Sephardi people in 1604. So many historians, the ones that are not with this fake propaganda, nationalistic Hispanic history that they call the Black Legend, the historian says that there was a time when this transatlantic slave trading started in Nabya Yala, that there were more enslaved Africans in Mexico than there were Spanish colonizers. So that is to make a sense, no, of how huge was this transatlantic trafficking, no, as they call it. So also it's very important to emphasize that this expulsion of the Iberian Peninsula brought also slaves from these communities to the so-called Americas. And so the ancestral indigenous people of these territories, of our nations, and the enslaved people from the Iberian Peninsula and the enslaved people from Africa, they were brought together in this continuous colonial genocide. So when we're speaking about estimated numbers, no? And this concept of estimated numbers is very, very important, no? Because when we talk about a continuation of this genocide, now we have to jump in Mexico to the year 2006. And in 2006 is the start of what we call the narco war, no? Firstly called with a coup d'etat by the political National Action Party with Felipe Calderon. And this started a whole out internal war in Mexico that we now have the estimated numbers, the official estimated numbers of 100,000 disappeared. But this been the estimated number for a long time, no? So we could say 150,000 disappeared since 2006 to this date. The quantity of assassinations related to this narco war is upwards of 300,000 people in Mexico. So a number that is not estimated is the yearly rate of assassinations, which in 2005, 2006, there were 13,000 assassinations in Mexico. But now in 2023, 24, we have 34, 35, 36,000 yearly assassinations. So then this is to give estimated numbers to make a representation of the war, and this is and to make it clear that there is a genocide against our people in Mexico. We could say that in Colombia, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, but I will only refer to Mexico, which is what I can testify. You know? So the conceptualization of this genocide, it has to do from one side with the objectives of the colonial powers that made this happen. So this is the Inquisition, this Spanish Inquisition that in the 15th century, they took the people and they burned them alive and they caught them and they tortured them and they decapitated them to subjugate them, to enslave them, to take control of their land and exploit the land, and also to take resources and take them into Europe for the benefit of their colonial wars. It's the same objective that we see in these days. So these soldiers, these Spanish soldiers, with the things of metal in the head, they are now we see as their direct descendants these paramilitary death squads that patrol our neighborhoods, and they have the exact same methods, They take our people, they cut them down, they disembowel them, they burn them alive, and they throw their bodies, as 500 years ago it started. So what is the objective? The objectives right now is the same. The objective is to enslave our people. It's not the enslavement of the old days, but now we have this neoliberal extreme exploitation of the workers that could even be a worse form of slavery. But we also have the same objective of taking our resources in this colonial project of mining companies, of fracking companies, of extraction of resources, natural gas, and all of that, the fossil fuels, that it was necessary for this extraction to balkanize our country, to make this genocide so that the people could not resist to these policies of constitutional reforms that make it legal for these companies to come to our country and make all this, As also the brother from Niger, was telling, the arms trade is something fundamental. When you balkanize a country, there's a lot of winning, and the private security companies is also an important part of this. And so this is to explain the continuity of this genocide, and that there are the same colonial powers with the same objectives and the same methods. But when we have this conversation amongst us, so in the communities, this is what we talk about. The people is what they talk about, and the objective of this proposition, this theory, historical theory, is to say that as the question, no, the brother said, the rebranding, no. In Mexico and in Spanish literature, in social sciences, you almost can never see that they use the term of reparations, no, or reparaciones. It's almost non-existent, only when they talk about the African struggle. But in the context of the Abya Yala, then they don't speak about reparations, no? And the communities even less. So when we speak about autonomy, we speak about insurgency, and we speak about community justice, no? And the political program that the organizations are implementing to combat this genocidal military strategy implanted in our communities are branded in this way. But it's just a semantics issue. It doesn't mean that it's different, no? It's a form of reparations, and that has also this continuity. It's not only the horrible, grotesque violence that has been committed against our nations all these centuries. The center of this issue is the fact that no amount of genocide, no amount of bloody massacres against our people, they never, even for one day, they never achieved their objective of subjugating our people. The resistance of the communities has been continuous every day since this colonial invasion, no? When we were speaking about the Mayan people, well, they were, since that first war in the 15th, 16th century, there were five Maya massive uprisings, including the last one from 1994 that is still going on. So I wanted to make it clear in this position that we have about our history. So nobody thinks that when we speak about Mexico or Central America or the Americas or Abya Yala, we are speaking about an issue that is separated, no, for the African struggle of reparations, no? It's the same struggle of the same communities with the same history, with the same colonial project that has been attacking us continuously. Thank you.
Okay, we've been told that we are over time, but we're going to extend dialogue for as long as we have. So that just means that if you wanted to get a tea or something, you can do so. But we've got basically literally 5 minutes, so we're going to try and take all the questions, as many questions that we can in the time. And if there are none on the screen in particular, I don't know if we're going to get them all. We'll take the first two, summarize, and then keep having the questions while people come back in for the next section. Does that sound okay? All right then, there was one hand at the back right at the start of this. Testing. Can we get the roaming mic there, please?
Hello. Testing. Yeah, here we go.
Oh, one and two, yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I wanted to give some contribution, but now I'll just ask the question. The question I'm asking, what are we going to do to make sure that the colonials' power, they apologize to us? Because as far as I'm concerned, for them to stand publicly and refuse to apologize to the Africans, that tell us that they are saying that what they have done is right. And they are happy of what they have done to us. And they want to continue doing it to us. So how are we going to make them apologize? Because my own suggestion is this. All these our African leaders have joined this African Union, or not African Union, how do you call it again, where they meet the king. Commonwealth. They all joined this Commonwealth. What are they gaining from this Commonwealth? Nothing. In fact, the Commonwealth is there to support their actions. Yeah. And this Commonwealth they have joined into, this can make, like, even Britain is the head of this Commonwealth, that gives them the power to tell our leaders what to do, they do it. Mm-hmm. It's a form of, like, the same thing that they have done to our grandfather. They continue holding a rope in our neck. They refuse to let go. You understand? The way to still sit down in our country, steal our minerals, steal everything that we have, and they take it from us and come back and sell it to us. Because if they leave us alone, let me say they leave us alone completely. We make our own decisions. We mine our minerals and refine them and sell it back to them. We won't be poor. We don't need them. These white colonial powers, they need us more than the way we need them. If only they leave us. So the question is, how are we going to make them apologize to us?
Can we get the second question as well? And then the second question here. And then we'll let someone from the panel
Thank you very much.
Take that.
Just thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm from Sudan, and my main reason here today, just to reflect what is going on in Sudan, because reparations and justice is a very important issue for what is going on there. Sudan is more than it is more than just a country in trouble. It is a key part of African history, culture. Since April 2023, there have been violence battles in the country. This show badly justice and heading are needed, not just for people in Sudan, but for all continents. This war has caused a humanitarian crisis that has forced many millions of people to leave their homes and cut off many basic needs like food, clean water, medical care, and so on. This kind of uncertainty affects more than just Sudan. It hurts the security and economic growth of all Africa, and now impacted on the situation in Chad, in Cameroon, in South Sudan, in Uganda, in Kenya, in so many African countries. When we think about reparation, it is important to remember that they are more than just a way to make it for past wrong. They are also a key step toward recovery and stability in Sudan, which is affects the growth of all continents, including reparative justice in the country, effort to peace build and to learn similar movements. I would be very grateful as Sudanese, my country facing so many troubles and so many intervene from Western countries like France and many other countries, this conference to address this issue and just give a chance to speak about Sudan is the heart of Africa. We help make Africa stronger and more stable by helping Sudan. It is a search for justice and renewal. This is aligned with Africa's rich history and shared goals. Let us work together to help the country that important to African past, present, and futures to get better. Thank you very much.
So just while we're getting the mic forward, the first question from Auntie was, what are we going to do to make sure the colonial powers apologize? I'm looking at you, Sister Piaba.
Okay, thank you. I think we have to, or we have most of us made peace with the reality that there is no apology that's ever going to come our way. If anything, like we have said, there is now a new intensified scramble for Africa and its resources, which means whatever we are waiting for them to apologize for, they are creating more harm and more problems currently. And that is why what is important right now is outside the conversations that we're having, is properly consolidated global solidarity in response to all the harms, not only in the African continent, but in all historically oppressed nations. Latin America, Asia, and so forth, because we do not only just share a history by the way of oppression, but when you actually look at our culture and our heritage, there are so many similarities between the three continents, and that should tell us something, that we are natural allies who must be working together in response to whatever is being served to us. The United States of Africa is the only solution for us, whether we like it or not. We have your European Union, you have the United States, but as Africans, we are so divided and we pretend to be confused as if we do not know what needs to happen. And the reality is that there is no response outside consolidating towards the United States of Africa. Intensifying the call for reparations, yes, they might not respond, yes, they might not give us what we want, but we must be the unnecessary noise. Every time they wake up, they must hear us. Every time, everywhere they go, they must hear us. They must not think that we've given up. They must not think that we've forgotten. Thank you very much.
We'll take, I mean, while people can be coming in, we can just continue to take questions if people are quite committed. So we'll take one from Uncle at the front, and then we'll go in an arc round, and we'll forget you. Where's the mic gone?
My name is Sam Sagara. I come all the way from East Africa, but I don't respect borders because they are not making. I'm an African first, and as an afterthought, I'm East African. Otherwise, I'm contributing in the fact that, as Nkrumah said a long time ago, whether this neocolonialism is the last stage imperialism, we are not aware. But because he talked about immediate African government unity, of which was in 1963 when it was formed, Nyerere, who was also very important in the top of Southern Africa as well, he talked about regional of East African community, ECOWAS, and Central Africa, and the other SADC of Southern Africa, and Magharibi and all that. But what we must now insist on, after looking at what Nyerere apologized, when he went to Ghana, apologized, because Nyerere he became a saint in the end, because he knew that the presidents of these so-called independent countries will become power hungry, and they will never relinquish any position as governors or anything else, but a president equivalent to President of America or Prime Minister of England, of which they meet daily on equal terms, but they just look at them and laugh. So what I are trying to say is that the British government and this European government and the United States will never apologize, because once they apologize, legally mandated to pay back what our money we put on the price of slavery and colonialism. But we must now try and see how we can have united government of Africa immediately and have closed economy, self-reliant economy, by which we don't mean to be self-sufficient, but I mean self-reliant economics, so that they can manufacture our own finished integrated industry in all African countries, or best from South Africa to Northern Africa, where we can be able to produce our finished goods. And we are talking about, in particular, not necessarily finished goods, but self-reliance in the food first, of which this gentleman was talking about a long time ago in 1974. And this gentleman is talking about we Africans must never underestimate ourselves, because the first man on earth was in Ngorongoro, Tanzania, Turkana, Kenya, and southern Ethiopia. Black like charcoal, that we were, and must articulate, and the first government ever, or first civilization anywhere in the world, was Egypt, of which we can see the example, pyramid built long time, how many years ago, I don't remember, but you can see that they're still standing, and there is no architecture that has been invented today to do the same thing as that architecture had done. Black-born architecture has been done anywhere in the whole world. And this is something that we must try to learn our history and self-respect first. Before anybody can respect us, we must respect ourselves, because what I have seen living in this country for the last 40 years, I have known that we are self-destructive because we don't unite. We don't seem to have a common purpose. And this is something that has become, historically, the invasion in America of FBI was destroying Black Star Line by Marcus Garvey when they were talking about, when he was employing black people only, and he was trying to do it, but the black people are the people who destroy him. And they know that very well, and that's exactly what we see, that we black people are the people who are self-destruction, and we must try to unite with the common purpose in order to realize our potential. Thank you very much.
That's why intergenerational dialogue matters. Can we pass, one and then two?
I
then
have a mic. I think thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for this event today. Something that I think has been very clear this past year is the lack of faith that can be had for existing legal processes. And that's in the context of Gaza. So despite motions from the ICJ, the ICC, these motions haven't been fruitful, and they haven't changed anything on the ground. So with that in mind, and with also in mind the kind of puppet governments that exist in most of Africa. So I hail from East Africa, Somalia. My question is, how do you think we as the diaspora in the global north can contribute to reparations?
Thank you. We'll take some more questions as well. So 1, 2, and 3.
Okay, so obviously
all contributions, they're not just questions.
This particular panel was on international relations and security, and obviously one form of international relations is the relations with the ex-colonizers, the West. But what we're seeing now is across the world, people are becoming more and more awake to what the West always has been and what it is. And I mean, we saw, I think, just this week, this BRICS conference where people gathered in Kazan, Russia, to basically, and all of these world leaders were going there, and the Sky News and the rest were going, but what about Ukraine, what about getting? People were like, well, we don't care. Obviously, you don't care about international law. Obviously, you don't care about this, that, and the rest. So we're not going to avoid going to this BRICS thing just because you guys are not friends with these people. But at the same time, we know that China, for example, in the Congo, still has, well, still is involved in child exploitation in the Congo. We know about the situation in Sudan and the role of Wagner and this, that, and the rest.
Last
so
comment.
yeah, so basically on the question of realpolitik, when we talk about international relations and we move beyond just the West and we talk about other countries that might be rising on the global stage as the West's credibility and in the world falls, that might still want to exploit Africa in some ways, but might still be partners in Africa. How do we approach this from a perspective of realpolitik? If we move towards a more multipolar world, how do we engage with non-Western countries cleverly?
All right, that was the final question, just because we actually finished 15 minutes ago, and this was just extra dialogue, and the closing plenary should have actually started by now. So people at the back, do make your way straight in. we're trying to close the conflict and resolution panel, but we wanted to give as much room as possible for conversations. Now there was two. Oh, and you can grab a tea and coffee and come back in. That was offered, but people are very keen to finish this conversation. So the two questions was, what can the diaspora do to contribute? And in summary, how can we look at this question from a very honest analysis of realpolitik in the actual world that exists today? And just while we find out who's going to take that last question, that's very important, because let's not pretend that there's not an elephant in the room. And that elephant in the room is that the blood that is being spilled in the name of the houses of the British Parliament, that blood isn't reaching, these places. That blood that has been, taken in the name of what's happening here, you don't see it in the West. But we are seeing an escalating war. We're seeing an escalating war across Africa. We've seen evidence of funding of destabilization projects on the ground. And we can see that there's a clear plan of encirclement of the global south, and particularly Africa and her resources. So that is the final thing that we need to close on. And which panelist would like to maybe take the last words in answering that question on what the diaspora can do to contribute, and particularly how do we navigate the international relations with the West?
I can try to give an answer.
We'll have Dr. Sahidi and then Omar.
The diaspora, well educated, has traveled and enriched with experience of outside world. We live here. We have acquired a lot of knowledge and a lot of insight also into different cultures. It's a privilege to live in a city like London, for example, which is a cosmopolitan city, where many cultures collaborate and cooperate and live together. So we can contribute to raise awareness and to educate people the necessity to stick together in order to reach something. And I think IS has shown or is showing the way forward. Yeah.
Thank you very
now,
much.
in terms of now BRICS countries, I think multipolarity in the world, political landscape is an opportunity also to voice, your concerns, because now the West is realizing that they need to listen to others. This is very important, because if they don't, they may end up with Russian or, North Korea. So I can see it in Niger, for instance, where I'm coming from. France is coming back and trying to help.
Thank you. And then Brother Omar.
Yeah, well, answering also the first question about forgiveness, and also a good relationship, good form of making a relation with the so-called West is the contrast, no? When you contrast something, a lie will bright up, no? So in this example, the recent ex-president, López Obrador, very famously, he asked for forgiveness to the Spanish crown, no? to this pseudo-monarchy that still exists in Spain. It was an official announcement that he was making the solicitation that the Spanish crown makes some kind of forgiveness for the Spanish Inquisition and the genocide. And of course, these monarchs, they laughed about it, no? And they ridiculized López Obrador. So at the same time, López Obrador started a political national project that was called the Plan de Justicia con los Pueblos Indígenas, the Justice Plan for the Indigenous Peoples. They announced that they will make this justice plan with 68 ethnic groups. And in his period, which was 2018 to 2024, they did it with 17 ethnic groups. So here the first example is that they call the ethnic groups, which is this form of ethnocide that the sister for Mangamasi was talking about. They are not groups, and they are ancestral nations. No, when you say that they are a group or a pueblo indígena, it's a form of making a nation small and making it irrelevant. When they say that there are 68 ethnic groups in Mexico, it's also a colonial lie, because at the very least, we linguists know that there's at least 100 languages, indigenous languages being spoken right now in Mexico. No? So at the same time that López Obrador made this justice plan in each of these nations, the genocide was going on. So for one example, the Yaqui tribe, or the Yaqui people from the north of Mexico in Sonora, on October of 2021, López Obrador presented in an event the justice plan for the Yaqui people, which implied, which was effectuated by asking forgiveness for the continuous 500 years of genocide. No? At the same time, in the 14th of July of 2021, 10 Yaqui land defenders were disappeared by the narco groups. No? So the families of these 10 disappeared. They were expelled from the event of López Obrador in October of forgiveness to the Yaqui people. No? So if you have like a serial killer that is asking forgiveness for his victims while he continues to kill people, this is not forgiveness. No, then this is a senseless thing. This is completely useless. But more than that, it's an insult to the people and to the victims. It's something extremely and profoundly insulting. So when we speak about asking for forgiveness to the colonial powers, while they are still killing us, is completely, I'm sorry, but it's completely senseless. Thank you.
I think that was actually a perfect way to close the session. So thank you to the panelists. Just for the screen's sake, thank you to Professor Justin Hansford, Makmid Kamara, Dr. Sahidi, Priya Lukka, Sister Piaba, and Brother Omar Farfan. And now this is the closing plenary, so people should come in and make their seats. If you want to stretch your legs, you don't have much time because we're done. Thank you very much.